Hironobu Sakaguchi is a name that travels hand in hand with the history of games studio Squaresoft and the role-playing game Final Fantasy. Such is his repute that his shadow still looms large over Squaresoft's successor company Square Enix, celebrated by many, mourned by others, and while still very much active in the industry today through his own studio Mistwalker, his career path through the 1990s has reached almost messianic levels of repute within JRPG circles, leading to his dubbing with monikers like the father of Final Fantasy. But just who is Hironobu Sakaguchi? What are his accomplishments within Final Fantasy and the video games industry more broadly, and how might we appraise his accomplishments and legacy today, both past and present? So, beginning at the beginning, and like many careers in gaming that started while it was still a fledgling industry, Sakaguchi's story is one of both fortune and happenstance. Indeed, as someone who never even liked games as a child, it was the discovery of pioneering RPG Ultima while at university, and, along with future Final Fantasy producer Hiromichi Tanaka, a chancing job application at Masafumi Miyamoto's new company Squaresoft that he applied to in part to avoid getting a corporate job. It was this that led Sakaguchi into the world of games. From the outset of his career, Sakaguchi had both creative and practical ambitions at Squaresoft. On the one hand, he saw it as a vehicle to improve his programming skills outside of university education, and on the other, he saw the potential for it to be a creative outlet and storytelling medium. The period of the early to mid-1980s saw his programming and planning work deliver on a range of titles, from lackluster ports to racing games, rail shooters, and dating simulators, which, while not necessarily creatively stimulating or financially successful, saw him fall upwards in some respects in this small company, becoming a development director by the mid-1980s. And it was at this point, in 1985-86, that the first real era and often retold moment of Sakaguchi's career took hold. The release of Chunsoft's Dragon Quest in 1986 was as much a validation as it was an inspiration to Sakaguchi's belief in games as a storytelling medium. He's often remarked on his admiration for the scale and scope of the game from a creative perspective, along with Chunsoft having devised a way to save progress and develop a long-form, story-driven title for a console system from a programmatic perspective. The success of Dragon Quest, along with the success of other fantasy-based titles such as The Legend of Zelda, which was released the same year, was the social proof and evidence that Sakaguchi needed to convince executives at Square that story-driven titles and the RPG genre had the potential to sell. And so this formed the foundation of his pitch for what would become Final Fantasy. The dubious response to Sakaguchi's project meant that he was left with a motley team of designers who would later become renowned Square alumni in their own right. Akitoshi Kawauzu, Koichi Ishii, and Nobu Uematsu were supported by the more experienced disciplines of programmer Nazir Gabelli and scenario writer Kenji Terada to get the project into its advanced stages, and at this time, when it started coming to fruition, more resource was offered to the project by the aforementioned Hiromichi Tanaka's team. And as we know today, Final Fantasy I was a success, particularly in Japan, and it paved the way for Squaresoft's elevation in the industry as a more reputable studio, rather than Miyamoto's doomed pet project. Such was the pace in the latter 80s and early 90s games industry that follow-up Final Fantasy games were released almost year on year following the success of the first game, and indeed this trend was maintained well up into the end of the 1990s. But for the following three titles, Final Fantasy II in 1989, Final Fantasy III in 1990, and Final Fantasy IV in 1991, we really saw Sakaguchi finding his way as a storyteller and designer, much of which is evidenced in the final products. The way the games were designed, the way the stories were told, but also, I think, what is less remarked upon is what was going on behind the scenes, and what is less evident in the finished games is how he was finding his way as a leader and a director. Indeed, interviews from the time show Sakaguchi discussing the scope of writing RPG titles compared to earlier games like Tetris, which was the work of a single programmer, while Sakaguchi instead viewed production like a sports team, where various members had their own attributes, their own levels of experience, and thus could complement one another. And indeed his own experience with working with veteran manga writers, which enabled his own storytelling skill set to improve, was evidenced across each subsequent Final Fantasy. And a classic example of this is transitioning from the generic light warriors in the first game to the unique fellowship of characters with identities and personalities in the second game, which enabled backstories and personal dilemmas to be explored. And scenario writer Kenji Terada later recalled that Sakaguchi really wanted to evoke emotion and make people cry with the second game, and that is why the protagonists were written in such a way that they had identities and dilemmas that we could emote with. So I really enjoy how Sakaguchi evolved his leadership style here, and while the earliest suggestions of his time at Square was that he was difficult to work for, by the time Final Fantasy IV rolled around, he had learned, it seems, to trust, to delegate, and elevate ideas of other staff members. And a classic case of this is composer Nobuo Uematsu, who had all of his scores rejected by Sakaguchi for Final Fantasy I, but by the middle era of the series, he was pretty much trusted to go away and get on with it, and they would publish what he'd composed. Likewise, Hiroyuki Ito had elevated from a debugger on the earliest Final Fantasy games to conceiving of and implementing the now legendary ATB system on Final Fantasy IV, and he would go on to design these battle systems up into his directorship and helming of Final Fantasy IX. And I think this is a notable aspect of Sakaguchi's career and how he works, because while he is rightly regarded as the father of Final Fantasy, he cannot be equated with the series in the terms of an auteur or its sole progenitor, in the same way that Hideo Kojima, for example, is quite famously a firm hand over almost all the facets of Metal Gear Solid's development, but rather Sakaguchi was a nurturing leader and director. He nurtured teamwork and team attributes as a way of progressing Final Fantasy to become the best it could be. Along with the release of Final Fantasy IV in 1991, this also saw Sakaguchi's elevation in Squaresoft to executive vice president, and it was the beginnings of what he would eventually lament as being a much more administrative and hands-off sort of management role. Indeed, his last directorial role at Squaresoft was 1992's Final Fantasy V, and even as early as this, we see Sakaguchi begin to delegate much more, with system design once again being handled by Hiroyuki Ito, and most notably I think the story credit being shared between Sakaguchi and Yoshinori Kitase. And Kitase's involvement is notable here because he represents for many the gradual passing of the torch from Sakaguchi's helming of the Final Fantasy project to what many might term as Squaresoft's New Guard, with Final Fantasy VI being co-directed by both Kitase and Ito, 7 and 8 being directed by Kitase, with increasing involvement from other Final Fantasy V alumni such as Tetsuya Nomura, who I've discussed in another episode. Indeed, looking to Sakaguchi's output post-Final Fantasy V, we have numerous producer and supervisor credits across a myriad of titles, from the highly regarded Chrono Trigger, Kazushige Nijima's directorial debut in Bahamut Lagoon, and many other RPGs, to seemingly random titles like fighting games such as Tobal No. 1, Urgites, and Bushido Blade. This period also saw the development and release of both Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, which were pivotal titles for Squaresoft's fortunes, and Sakaguchi, in his own words, passing this torch to the New Guard members, such as the big three, Kitase, Nomura, and Najima. And while I think Sakaguchi was pretty hands-on in both of these titles, with interviews from the time surprisingly stating that he oversaw and owned the battle system aspects of Final Fantasy VII more so than the story, and he was very encouraging of the team working on the innovative new FMV sequences, even going so far as to making grandiose statements to the press saying that Final Fantasy VII wasn't in competition with Dragon Quest, it was in competition with Hollywood, that sort of thing. I think the era of 6, 7, and especially Final Fantasy VIII was the beginnings of him being more of a guiding hand to production teams rather than being the heart and soul of the project. And a classic example of this is in Final Fantasy VIII, which was largely helmed by Kitase and the New Guard. Sakaguchi was relegated to an executive producer rather than an actual hands-on producer, but this was in large part because he was filming his feature film The Spirits Within at this time. But even so, his input could be felt, because he looked over the concept of Final Fantasy VIII. He said the theme of the game felt like it was much more of a love story than anything else. And so the entire arc of the game was recalibrated and centralised around that theme of love. And this is a testament, I suppose, to Sakaguchi's kind of subtle but integral influences on Final Fantasy, even on the games that he was less directly involved with. Coming to Final Fantasy IX, we have what many regard as the true turning point of the series, the end of an era and a retrospective celebration of the Sakaguchi era of titles that preceded the cyberpunk-inspired futurism of Final Fantasies VI, VII and VIII. And while it has further significance now, because retrospectively we know it was Sakaguchi's last hands-on role in any Final Fantasy game, at this particular time Sakaguchi wanted it to be a retrospective and throwback sort of game because he knew Squaresoft was at this turning point in history because of all the technological innovations that were coming down the line and so on. Final Fantasy X had already been pitched and signed off on in terms of its 3D space, in terms of voice acting and so on. So I think this game is massively significant for those that want a glimpse into the Sakaguchi era, and I think for those that are fond of Sakaguchi, those that want that culminative experience for what his sort of Final Fantasy game is, I would certainly say that Final Fantasy IX is the place to go, and it really is one of the most historically significant Final Fantasy games when we consider what had come before, what had come since, and what was going on in that particular time in history. Now, as I've touched on, the first years of the new millennium were overall considered a low point, and certainly a turning point for Sakaguchi's career. He had reached an all-time high with Final Fantasy IX, and then immediately hit an all-time low with the release and box office flop of his debut feature film, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. And for my part, I find this to this day a really weird aspect of Sakaguchi's oeuvre. I've tried looking at it objectively, I've tried viewing it through a lens of it being a Sakaguchi piece of work, despite not liking the film, and I just find it jars with his prior creative. But that said, embarking on a feature film, it does chime with Sakaguchi's ever-present drive to push boundaries, try new things, as he always had done with every single Final Fantasy. So whether there was any hubris involved here, we had these prior comments of Final Fantasy VII contending with Hollywood, for example, whether he wanted the status of directing the first ever photorealistic CG film, or simply whether there was too many cooks in the kitchen, it got into that Hollywood production cycle. Who knows, but the film flopped, and it tarnished Square's reputation and finances, it tarnished the name of Final Fantasy, at least to outside average Joes who hadn't heard of it before, and Sakaguchi ultimately magnanimously committed corporate seppuku by leaving Square shortly after the film flopped and taking responsibility for its failure. And much like the founding of Final Fantasy back in '86, this period of Sakaguchi's career, this period of Squaresoft, has been discussed to death. I've touched on it a few times on the channel, owing to Sakaguchi's departure being pointed to by many for what is perceived as the decline in Final Fantasy, and indeed Square's fortunes. But for Sakaguchi's part, in terms of his broader career, he spent time in Hawaii after this in a self-proclaimed state of doing nothing, though it is prudent to note that his next venture, which was the studio Mistwalker, was trademarked in 2001 before it was officially founded and started producing games in 2004. And this is what many regard to be Sakaguchi's second wind as a creator and a game designer, because we saw the release firstly of Blue Dragon, which was a turn-based RPG, a throwback in some ways to these traditional fantasy games. This was followed by Lost Odyssey, and both of these were kind of RPG titles, but were met with considerably mixed reception considering they were Sakaguchi games. And after a string of mobile games, we had the release of Last Story and latterly Fantasian, and these games I think are really what had audiences feeling like Sakaguchi had returned to form with the Mistwalker studio. But really, even for those that disliked the mobile games and disliked were confused by some of what Mistwalker put out. Again, I think it's really looking at what's going on beneath the hood that I think shows where Sakaguchi's career was at this time, and the ethos of Mistwalker and his intent to do things on his own terms really shines through if we look at what's going on. And indeed, there's quite a telling interview from the time where Sakaguchi was asked whether Mistwalker would pair up with Sony and make games for the PlayStation, because of course they had famously had a relationship with Square. Perhaps unexpectedly, Sakaguchi outright said he didn't like Sony's president, and he said he didn't want to work with them, hence the initial releases of Mistwalker being across Microsoft and later Nintendo hardware. Beyond this, the structure of Mistwalker is the nurturing of micro studios, almost as a pseudo publisher or an umbrella developer of games, and the makeup of the company is that ideas are pitched and then delegated between these independent groups or mini studio teams, which owes to the variety of titles and platforms that Mistwalker develops for. So this may be why some feel that Sakaguchi's style is somewhat diminished or diluted across Mistwalker games, but for me it's just another example of his innovative leadership style, which does entrust a lot of production to individuals and individual teams, and the principle of Mistwalker is precisely the freedom to innovate and create without the executive hand of Square or Sony or any other sort of exec level company neutering someone's creative ideas or their ability to fulfill their vision. So that's a top level view of Sakaguchi's tumultuous trajectory through the games industry. I think there is a fine line between audiences who revere this founding father of Final Fantasy for that decade or so between 86 and the latter 90s, and then those latter day audiences who tend to have mixed feelings about Mistwalker's output and what Sakaguchi's doing, because rather than making like carbon copies of Final Fantasy, there's a bunch of mobile games going on, there's all sorts going on at Mistwalker. But I think looking broadly at all of this, what I've tried emphasising here as the common thread through Sakaguchi's career is not necessarily his writing style, his stories, or this nostalgic view of him as the Final Fantasy guy, but actually his entire approach to the creative process, the management and leadership attributes that are combined with the desire to push the medium forwards, which is evidenced in everything from each successive Final Fantasy game to the spirits within and the structure of Mistwalker. And even while being a producer, there are those that felt his input was integral to creating successful Final Fantasy games, such as FF7, such as FF8, and many that consider Final Fantasy to have been on a downward trajectory since the start of the new century, place blame almost exclusively on Sakaguchi's departure.